Hieronymus Bosch. His name, Hieronymus, is the Latin form of Jerome. And he comes from a town that we haven't talked about before, Bosch. Bosch is in the North Netherlands. And we don't know his birth date. When people feel they must give a birth date, they say somewhere around 1450. But that's based on extremely little evidence. The fact that the first document that they have of him from 1474, he is an adult at the time. And that's basically all they know. So we don't know exactly when he was born. We do know the year he died, in 1516. This is a 16th century drawing that says that it's Hieronymus Bosch. It's from the Codex Aureus, this book of pictures, drawings of famous people. He was born in Bosch in the North Netherlands, and the name, you can kind of break it down. Hertogen would be the duke. Bosch would be woods or forest. So it really translates as the Duke's Woods. He comes from, a long line of painters, from a family of painters. We know that his grandfather was a painter, that his father was a painter, that his uncles were painters, that his brother was a painter. So it's a painting family. But they did not use the name Bosch. They used, for the family name, they used Van Aken, which probably means from Aachen, which of course is a town, a city in Germany that's today would be right over the border from Belgium. You know, if you get on the train in Brussels and you want to go through Cologne, stop off in Aachen and see the Palatine Chapel. Charlemagne's Palace Chapel is still there. But Bosch changes his name. Maybe he feels he's not from Aachen, Van Aachen. He's from Bosch. So he changes his name to Bosch. If he were English, it would be Jerome Woods or Jerome Force, but you do need to use the name Bosch. Now, we know something about some of the commissions that he had that don't survive anymore. He did get commissions locally for the church at Bosch, and also for the Confraternity of Our Lady. And both his father and he were members of this confraternity, which was very prestigious. Someone said that the members were priests and patricians. Now, how could a painter, a manual craftsperson, qualify as a patrician? Well, actually, he did very well for himself. He married into a wealthy family, and he seems to have had a comfortable living. They're judging from the taxes that he paid. And around 1500s, his taxes were rising, and they assume this is because his wealth was rising as he became a very popular painter and had a lot of commissions. Judging from the tax record, by 1512 to 13, he is the sixth wealthiest citizen in town. He and his wife lived in the house that had been her grandfather's, which was right across the street from the city hall. It's in the sort of main political and financial area in Bosch. He's unusual, well, in a number of ways, but for one reason, he signed his paintings on the painting, not on the frame. Well, I mean, maybe he did sign some on some frames that we don't know about, but we do know that there are 8 works that most people consider to be authentic works, really by Hieronymus Bosch, that he signed. And here is the signature from one of them, from the Hermit's Triptych, which we won't be showing you. Now, one of the problems is that some of his followers also signed his name on their paintings. And there's a 16th century source, Felipe de Rivera, and he says, he talks about a particular pupil of Bosch, and he tells us, very, very good, and he signs his master's name on the paintings. He doesn't know whether that's, like homage to the master, or if it's just because he figures the paintings will sell better. So you can make up your mind about that. Unfortunately, we have no dated paintings by Bosch. So all the dates that we're giving you in the course, you will find different dates from different sources. The first example, the first work we're going to talk about, actually, there's a wide disparity in dates that's given to it. So people have to figure out some way of thinking, well, which Boschs would be the earliest and the latest? And they may not agree with the supposition that someone else has. So we're not going to do too much with dating. I'm going to talk to you about this one. The first thing that's in your textbook that we're going to talk about is this tabletop that is painted with the 7 deadly sins and the 4 last things. And you'll notice that your textbook, Jim Snyder's book, dates this about 1480 to 85. And Larry Silver, who wrote a book on Bosch, thinks that it's after 1500. Well, that's a pretty wide gap, actually. Why? Well, I don't know exactly. Larry Silver said why. It may be because it does not seem to be quite as deep as some of his works. That the painting quality may not be, as high. That Snyder may say, well, this must be an early work. Snyder probably died before they published the information from infrared reflectography, but Silver talks about it, and he says that the underdrawings are in Bosch style, and they show pentimenti. We talked about what pentimenti meant, when we were talking about Roger van der Weyden, for example, or Robert Campin. Pentimenti is an Italian word. It means thoughts, but we could kind of think of it as meaning first thoughts. In other words, I put something down and then I change my mind. I'm still thinking about it. So there are changes from the underdrawing to the surface, and you can see him making changes, which suggests that it is a design by Hieronymus Bosch, because if somebody were just copying it, they wouldn't have to make those kind of changes. So Larry Silver suggests that it's probably a design by Hieronymus Bosch with his underdrawing, and that there is some workshop execution in it. And he thinks this suggests that it could be later in his life when he's more popular, getting lots of commissions. But I guess you can date it anywhere from 1480 to after 1500, because there's arguments to be made for both sides. Okay, we said the 7 deadly sins. You've probably heard of those. What are the 4 last things? And those are those circles that you see in the corners. Death, judgment, heaven, and hell. Everyone's going to die. According to Christian belief, everyone will be judged. And then they will be going either to heaven or hell. So those are the 4 last things. And then you have this big circle in the center, and around it are scenes with the 7 deadly sins. They're almost like a genre painting. They're little scenes of everyday activity, but the everyday activity is sinful. Now, the inscriptions on the banderoles give us an indication of what this is all about. They're both from Deuteronomy, And on the top, it translates as, "For they are a nation void of counsel, and there is no understanding in them. If they were wise, they would understand this. They would discern their later end." So they're talking about people, even a nation, where they don't think about their later end. They don't think about their spiritual well-being. They continue to sin. The bottom banderole or scroll says, it's God speaking. It says, "I will hide my face from them. I will see what their end will be. For they are a perverse generation, children in whom there is no faithfulness." And that, I'm idea of I'll hide my face from them. I'm not going to give them my favor, but I'm going to be watching is essentially, as we'll see, carried out pictorially in this work of art. We should mention the circles. Bosch does use circles a number of times for his paintings. And circles have a number of associations. They are, in the 15th century, the shape of a mirror. Remember the convex mirror on the back wall of Jan van Eyck's Arnolfini double portrait. So they are the shape of a mirror. They reflect, they show. It's also the shape of the universe, or the shape of the earth, because it was believed that the earth was a sphere. So a circle is a flattened sphere, if you will. The earth was a sphere in the center of the universe. And then there were the concentric circles of the planets, the wandering bodies in the heaven that you can see with the naked eye, which would be the moon, the sun, and the planets that you can see, Mercury, Venus, Mars, Jupiter, and Saturn. And you could also see those, of course, with some of the early telescopes, but they had to have much more advanced telescopes before they could see the further planets. Another shape is, it's the shape of a ball, and including an eyeball. And as I said, that's going to really be pictorially, this is pictorially very important for this painting. Right in the center, you have a series of concentric circles, and in the center there is an image of Christ as the man of sorrows. And he's pointing to the wound in his side. He's holding up his other hand. It's very small in this reproduction, but presumably what he's doing is showing the wound that's in his hand as well. And there's an inscription below in Latin, "Cave, cave," which means beware, beware. And then there's an abbreviation, it's DUS, so it could be either Deus, God, or Dominos, Lord. And then the last word, vidit, means sees. So beware, beware, God sees, or beware, beware, the Lord sees. Same meaning. Radiating from the center are a series of lines. And this gives the center circles the appearance of the iris in the eye, with Christ in the pupil. It also suggests things like rays of sunlight, rays coming from the sun. Well, let's look at the 7 deadly sins and the 4 last things. And of course, the inscription is warning the viewer, that God, or the Lord, sees all their sins. And he's also showing what to do about it, because as he points to the wound in his side, he's reminding the viewer that Christ died to redeem humanity from sin. So let's look at each of these 7 deadly sins. The first one I'm showing you is avaritia, or greed. And here you see some people involved, presumably with some shady financial dealings. I'm presuming they're going to try to cheat the poor man, out of his coin. They seem to be, they have their money bags handy, they have their purses handy, and they're conferring. Then there is invidia, or envy. And it's kind of interesting, what different kinds of envy are they talking about? They seem to mean by envy coveting something that someone else has. So you can see this, I'm calling him a tradesman because he's middle class, so presumably that's the social class. But there's this man in, his house. He's looking out over the door, and he's sort of glowering at this aristocratic young man who's has a lot of leisure. He can go hawking. He's holding his hawk by his hand. And his servant is carrying this huge bag of presumably grain or food or something like that back to his palace. He doesn't even have to carry it himself. So the older middle class guy is jealous. He envies the wealthy aristocrat. His ease of life. Next to him, his daughter is sort of she's inside the house, and it's like there's little bars that are keeping her and her suitor apart. So presumably the suitor is coveting the young woman. He'd like to, we hope, marry. And then you have 2 dogs, and one of them is just barking at the man who's not paying any attention to him. This older man, he's looking at the rich guy. And the older man is holding this big bone in his hand, and the dog is barking, barking, barking. Well, the dog wants that bone, so he's, envious of the man because he's got the bone. And it's also sort of interesting because when you look at it, there's other bones lying on the ground. So the dog does have bones. He just wants that bone. And the same thing, the envious older man does seem to have a comfortable house. He's not poverty-stricken, but he's still envious of the person who has more. So you might say you start to make up little stories. And as I said, it's almost like, they're little genre paintings with a moral. Wrath, or ira, and also known as choler or anger, is when you get really angry and violent. And here you can see there's been these figures have been having a knockdown, drag-out fight. Somebody's hit somebody else over the head with a stool here, or a little table. And the man has a sword out. It looks like he's going to try to kill the other person. And he's holding a pitcher, so presumably his ira, his wrath, his choler, was fueled on by drink as well. When I first looked at this, I thought he was trying to kill his wife, but the more I look at it, the more I think his wife is trying to restrain him from doing bodily damage to the man in brown, the man he's fighting with. None of them look very happy. Superbia, or pride, is supposed to be the worst of the 7 deadly sins, the sin from which all the other sins progress. But in this case, Bosch is using it more as a kind of vanity, really, because it's a woman's pride in her appearance, perhaps the furnishings of her house, which are quite well to do. You can see all those pitchers and vessels at the top of the piece of furniture. And she's admiring herself in one of these convex mirrors. And she's got an elaborate headdress on. And who is holding up the mirror for her but a devil, and wearing the same type of headdress? There's a chest or a box down on the floor, and this seems to be her jewel box, from which possibly she's gotten jewels out, although we don't see those. But we do see that there is a rosary. It's coiled over the end of the box, but she's just left it in the box. She's not using it. In other words, she's not paying any attention to spiritual things. And if you look through the doorway into the next room, there's a young man, perhaps her son, and he's also admiring himself in the mirror. So 2 examples of superbia or pride. Luxuria is usually translated lust, but it also has a wider implication of, enjoying sensual pleasures which include and lead to lust. So here we have some aristocrats lounging around, being entertained by their fools. And presumably they were also entertained with the musical instruments. There's a harp, kind of recorder there. And often, musical instruments accompanying loving pairs of people do suggest luxuria or lust. And you can see that the couple in the back, it looks like the man is probably propositioning the woman. They're getting together. Acedia or sloth. Here's another one of the examples where the person is ignoring his spiritual well-being to follow one of the deadly sins. The nun is here. She's holding out a rosary. She has a prayer book in her hand. But the man is paying no attention. He's gotten up and gotten dressed. He looks like he's ready to go outside. But instead, he's laid back, got a soft pillow, and is taking a little snooze in the middle of the day. His dog, likewise, is having a little snooze. There's a book there. Is it for, we don't know if it's a religious book or a book of records or something like that. There's a little niche with a spindle in it, which is not in use. So suggesting someone who's just, idling away his days. Gluttony, this one's pretty obvious. Gula or gluttony, and everybody in the picture, from the fat man, the thin man, this big fat dirty baby, is they're just devouring food and drink, and the baby is asking for more. The baby's trying to get some, and the father isn't giving his son the food, but it looks like he's had plenty, and the mother's bringing even more food. Another roast piglet or something. There's like I say, lots of food. There's a toasting stick here, the 2 prongs with a sausage on it to be cooked over the fire. And there's a little potty chair there for the baby or for the toddler, because after you eat all this stuff, well, it's got to go somewhere. Okay, those are the 7 deadly sins. If you have practiced any or all of these and have not repented, well, you'll know where you go after death, they believed. And when we say the deadly sins, we mean mortal sins. There are some sins that are venial, but you have to confess these. You have to try to put these sins aside and do better and sincerely mean it and do your penance and get absolution, or these mortal sins, these deadly sins, can send you to hell. So this whole painting is warning that sin has immortal consequences. And of course, death comes to all people. So here we see an image of a man on his deathbed. This is one of the 4 last things, death, the first of the 4 last things. And you'll notice that, this man is prosperous. He's got a really wonderful bed and covers and things like that, pillows. And over the headboard, there is an angel who's leaning over the headboard and a devil who's sort of sitting astride the headboard, waiting for the man's soul. So evidently it's not decided yet. Death is looking out behind the curtain, behind the arras. He's coming, he's approaching. This man doesn't have much more time. But he's doing what the belief of the time said that he should do in order to save his immortal soul. There's a priest there, and the priest is administering extreme unction, or the last rites. Presumably, the man has been able to confess. Now he's going to be anointed with the holy oil. There is a candle that, if they're conscious and able, that is given to them as their life wanes away. And you can see that there's other religious people here. There's a sub-minister, maybe an acolyte. There's a nun. There's a young man. Could this be his son? And there's a friar, and the friar is holding up a crucifix, reminding him to rely on the merits of Christ in order to be saved. So, it looks quite promising that this man will probably be saved. It is an exemplar of what you should do. You'll notice that there's two women in the next room, and I try to figure that out. I'm assuming that perhaps it's either family members, a wife, daughter, or maybe a friend comforting the wife as the man dies. After death comes judgment. And here they're showing the last judgment, the resurrection of the dead. When Christ returns, as the Creed says, to judge the living and the dead, or in this case, just to judge the dead who have been revived. And you have saints in heaven. They seem to be separated by gender. And angels blowing the last trumpet, and Christ seated on the rainbow with his feet on a globe of the earth or the universe, and the lily of mercy and the sword of justice are symbolically on either side. So it's a pretty simple, bare bones last judgment, but it's got the essentials. Christ is returning to judge, and there's two places that people can go. One is heaven, and the other one is hell. And these are the third and fourth of the last things. So, how is heaven represented? It's is it an ecclesiastical structure? Does it look like a church, or does it look like a palace? Something that sort of shares attributes of both. God or Christ is on this enthroned on this dais, raised up, elevated, with the angels surrounding him, and then more angels kneeling and adoring him, and then in the foreground we have the musical angels. As we look at our left, St. Peter is welcoming the people into heaven. But the devils aren't done yet. There's one devil here who is trying to grab this woman and pull her away. Don't think he's going to succeed, because there is St. Michael, the archangel. He'll take care of that devil. He'll send him away. Michael, the archangel, of course, is mentioned in the Bible in the book of Revelation, where he battles the dragon who represents the devil. And for those who followed the 7 deadly sins, this is where they end up. And each one of the punishments has a label on it for the sin, so that these are appropriate to the sin. Down in the lower foreground, the bottom part of the circle, is pride, superbia. And the two prideful people now have their comeuppance. The devil is holding up the mirror, toads, and this strange kind of bird is sort of attacking them. Maybe it's supposed to be a peacock. The bird of pride. I hadn't thought of that. But they're not having a good time of it. The lustful couple is trying to continue their lustful ways. They're in bed together, but they are being tormented by devils, who pull at them and poke at them and don't let them get along with what they want to do. This sort of pointed red tent says gula, and there is a fat man at a table, and the presumably what's happening is the devils are just stuffing him, and won't let him stop. It's horrible. The slothful man is being beaten with instruments of work, instruments of a blacksmith's work, because it's a hammer and he's leaning over an anvil. And then as you look here, you can see a man stretched out and someone stabbing him. That is NVIDIA. And down below, there is a great cauldron with fire, keeping it bubbling. And within that cauldron, there are coins that are probably being melted down in it. They're falling into it, and people are in the golden coins as they melt. So each punishment is considered to be appropriate to the sin. The same use of a circle, with quite a different picture, is shown here. This is a walking figure. He's carrying a backpack. His clothes are ragged. He's holding what seems to be either a staff or a club. It's got a knob at the end, so it could be used as a weapon. And he's looking over his shoulder as he moves to the right. And there's a dog who's growling at him. Who is he? Well, this work of art by Bosch has a number of different names. It's one of those works that people come up with all different ideas about who it might be. Your book just used a more generic term, the Dutch, landloper. We might say a tramp or a vagabond or a hobo. But he's a landloper. He's tracking, he's traveling by foot. So here are just some of the names. People have called this the vagabond, the wayfarer. He's also been considered to be the prodigal son when he is living his dissolute lifestyle. And he's run out of all his money, and he's destitute. Against that, some people point out that he looks like an older man. He does not look like a young man who's come into his inheritance. He's been considered to be the representative of every man, or as they say in Dutch, ilk. A pilgrim on the road of life. Because he has this pack, it's often said that he must be a peddler, selling his wares. There's an article that suggests that he's a representative of the sin of sloth. And I just found an article on the web that said that they thought he was the wandering Jew. Well, that's a lot to choose from. What we can say is he does seem to be on a road, the road of life. So whether we can call him a pilgrim on the road of life or everyman or a peddler, there does seem to be that idea of someone who is traveling through life. And he's looking over his shoulder. Is it a little longingly or is it wearily? What is he looking at? What's going on over there? Well, the house as you can see, it's not in good repair. The shutter's falling off. It's a half-timber house, and it has a sign of the White Swan. And you can see what kind of house it is by what's going on in the doorway. There's a man embracing a woman. This is a brothel. And there's another man peeing against the side of the house. And we see pigs and piglets at the trough. And of course, he said the dog is growling. I was thinking of this, and I was thinking, hey, there are some of the 7 deadly sins represented here. The dog growling could be choler. The pigs eating could be gluttony. You certainly could have both avarice and lust with the goings on in the house. And even the urine is an aftermath of so much drink for gluttony. I don't know if that's exactly what they're doing. Maybe the sin is not sloth, but envy, but not envying something you should want. At any rate, the man seems to be on the road of life. He's looking back at this sinful going on. Has he been a sinner who is now repentant, or just every man who sins and then continues on his journey through life? And suggest that he can choose his direction. He could go back to the brothel. He could go on with the road. The road does not lead to some great perfect place, however. It's a little hard to see in the reproduction, but up on the far distance there are gallows. So there are still tribulations and dangers for the landloper to encounter. This wasn't the only time that Bosch used the subject. We're going to talk about the Haywain triptych later, and on the outside of the Haywain triptych there is another scene of this landloper or vagabond, dressed very much the same. Knees torn out. He's got that club/staff. He's got in this case, it's almost like a wicker basket, it looks like, for his pack. Things are going on. Some things are the same. The dog is still growling at him. It's a different dog. But some other things are going on in the background. We see a man who has been robbed and is being tied to a tree as he's been divested of everything he owns. And then we see peasants dancing. In the foreground, there's some bones of I've been trying to figure out what strange creature that is. It might, I don't know what he's trying to do. It's an elongated skull anyway. And then in the very distant background, you can clearly see the gallows here. So, we have evil continuing in the world, death, threatening the traveler. And, are the people who are making merry, are they just being silly because they're not paying attention to, their immortal soul? Or, is this, pleasant, harmless activity? So there, the two are similar subject. The adoration of the Magi is, of course, one of the most frequently painted subjects in Renaissance art. Bosch, as we might expect, does it a little bit differently. You can see this triptych, which is in the Museo del Prado, and I should tell you it's been copied a number of times. There's a copy in Philadelphia. There's a copy in Upton House in Banbury in England. There's probably some more. But this is the one that everyone agrees is by Hieronymus Bosch. And now you can see a vast landscape with little figures in. We'll eventually look at some of those, going back to this very exotic-looking city. Is that supposed to be Jerusalem in the distance, or Bethlehem? But at any rate, there it is. And then in the foreground, we have this rickety house or stable, that almost looks like it's going to come plunging down any minute now. We have Mary, Christ child, the three magi, and some other figures. We'll take a look at those other figures. Normally you would think, well, okay, the magi could have followers, a retinue. But there's some very odd things about the figures that we see in this stable, just peering out of the door. You might notice that the shepherds are not coming around. They're sort of climbing up onto the roof, which is bending a little precariously. Then on the wings, we have the donors with their, presumably their namesake saints, their patron saints. St. Peter for the man, St. Agnes for the woman, and you can see the lamb or sheep that tells us that this is Agnes, because the word Agnes and Agnes are so close. And then there's another figure. Let's take a little closer look. Well, first let's look at the exterior. When the wings are shut, we have a semi-grizzly eye. You can see that there's some color in the donor figures, but mostly monochromatic picture of the Mass of St. Gregory. Now, this was a very popular subject to show the real presence of Christ in the Eucharist. As the story went, there was a attending priest when St. Gregory, the Pope, was giving Mass, and the priest had some doubts about whether that was really the body and blood of Christ. It tasted like bread. And so, he had some doubts. And as Gregory says the Mass, Christ appears as the host, as the man of sorrows, as you can see, as the suffering Christ, because the Mass is believed to reenact the crucifixion in a bloodless fashion. So it's a miracle, and proves to the doubting priests that this is truly the body and blood of Christ. So we're opening it up. We're going to look back inside, and let's start with the left side. We take a look at the donors. And in the background, we see below this little roof that looks like it's got holes in it. It's about to fall down too. St. Joseph has built a fire, and he's drying diapers. He's holding up what is presumably, either the diapers or the swaddling clothes. In other words, he's helping Mary with what is, usually considered to be woman's work. Now, we might look at this a little differently. Every time I look at this, I think, oh, isn't that nice? Isn't it good? He's helping out. Isn't that wonderful? But that's me as a 20th, 21st century person, who thinks perhaps the labor should be shared a little bit equally between male and female. It's quite possible, and possibly even probable, that Joseph being taken away from Mary and the baby Jesus and put in the wing at the side and further back, that it's a kind of marginalizes him, and even mocks him. This old man is just good for drying diapers. Or could we look at it and see it in a positive sense? Because, Joseph is, one of his characteristics is that he is humble. And here he's also being very helpful. And I think we have talked about the shift in ideas about Joseph, that during the Middle Ages, he was often the butt of jokes and comedy in some of the plays. He's the old man who doesn't know how his young wife got pregnant. But at the end of the Middle Ages, as we've said before, with the writings of such people as Gertsen, Joseph became the model of the good father, and he's a good foster father to Christ, since he's not supposed to be the biological father. But he protects and cares for Mary. He's a hard worker who, tries to support his family. In other words, he has what we would consider to be middle-class virtues. Now, maybe Bosch hasn't gotten with that program yet. Or maybe he has, because I guess we could read it either way. We can see some of the traditional iconography, a stable that looks like it might fall down, possibly referring to the old law that is passing away as the new covenant and the era under grace begins. So, it's kind of originally shown, but that's something we've seen before, is ruined stables. The three magi, each from a different age group, the oldest one, the one who's sort of in the middle, and then the youngest, and also the magi who represent the three continents of the world. The eldest magus for Europe, the middle magus as Asia, and the black magus as Africa. And of course, there's Mary holding the Christ child on her lap. As the, Ara Dei, or Ara Cole, the altar of heaven, the altar of God. And I don't know if you can make it, there is an ass there, looking out from the stable. But there's some other figures that are a little unusual. I mean, we sometimes have shepherds, coming. But here they aren't seeming to be coming out to the front. They're climbing up on the roof. What's that all about? And there are some peculiar-looking people, really sinister-looking people, appearing out of the stable. So first, let's look at some of the Magi's gifts. One of the interesting things is that the Magi's gifts often represent Old Testament scenes that prefigure New Testament events. In other words, God gave hints through history. He gave omens that were supposed to point people in the right direction to let them know what would happen with the coming of Christ. And of course, Christian scholars would, I also they would mine the Bible. They'd go through and look for these things. The gift that the oldest magus has presented to the Christ child and to his mother, right at her feet, it seems to be some kind of a golden sculpture, and it shows the sacrifice of Isaac. Isaac is bringing the kindling, but the angel is stopping Abraham from slaying his son. But then there's something kind of weird and sinister at the bottom. There's these toads, and toads usually are associated with things like witchcraft and devilry. They're considered to be evil omens. So what are they doing there? Well, one suggestion is that they're showing that even with what seem to be, really good people, we know the Magi later on go on and they're supposed to become saints and martyrs, that evil is everywhere. And, even in the best circumstances, even the best people may have to repent. And of course, we know that that's what they're supposed to do according to Christian doctrine. This cape over the shoulder of the middle-aged magus is just, as you can see, very, very lavish. And it's a very clear scene that we have King Solomon and Sheba, who is kneeling. Now, in things like the Biblia Pauperum and the Spectrum Humani Salvationis, where you have these parallel scenes of Old and New Testament events, Solomon and Sheba is very, very frequently used for the Old Testament type or prefiguration of the adoration of the Magi. And then down sort of on the hem, we see a burnt offering where it's animal sacrifice. And of course, the sacrifice of Christ, shown here, will replace and redeem, make animal sacrifice obsolete, unnecessary, because Christ's sacrifice replaces all of that. A little closer view there. You might look at that crown or helmet as headgear that the figure behind him is holding upside down. It's kind of grotesque toad-like devils on it. Ooh, that's weird. We'll talk about that soon. So we have prefigurations, which are, in some ways, you could see them as a kind of prophecy that God works through history to indicate what's going to happen. The Savior is going to come. And Christ is the fulfillment of all of those types or prophecies that we see hinted at in the gifts and in the clothing of the Magus. Now, here is the black Magus, the one who represents Africa, and he's just dressed in this beautiful white garment. It's very, very lavish. And he holds his gift, which is spherical. It has what is presumably a sculpture, although it almost looks like it's a live figure of a bird eating a red fruit, and connected with a little chain, another, I suppose, metal, but another fruit that he's holding up. So a little bit like a raspberry, maybe. And on the vessel itself, you can see here clearly, you see a enthroned figure or a person seated down with a crown and a scepter, and two figures wearing armor, another figure kneeling and offering something to him. And, there's a number of places in the Bible, where someone is kneeling and offering something to a king. One of the suggestions that Larry Silver made was that these might be the three mighty men who come to David, and when they find that he wants water from the well near the gate of Bethlehem, he goes and they go and risk, there's a war going on, and they risk their lives to bring him that water. And when he does, he says, he can't drink it because so many people have risked their lives for it. And he pours it out. So it becomes a sacrifice. So you have this, this idea of, as the Magi are kneeling to the Christ child, so these men are kneeling to King David, who is the ancestor of Christ, and bringing him something, that he wants, but I should say he doesn't feel like it's politic to use it. He sacrifices the thing that he really wants. So Christ sacrifices his life. And then there's this embroidery, some kind of fancy work around the hem of the Magus's Magus's overgarment. And they're kind of chimera. You have birds with human heads. Now, when we think about birds with human heads, we might think of something like the Sphinx from ancient Greece, but this is not ancient Greece. When you're thinking about Bosch, he combines animal and human parts. So you almost think of a devil. So what does this mean? Are these supposed to suggest that even the Magi are sinful, that there's devils waiting for them too, that evil is present everywhere, and of course all men need salvation. Now here is one of the strangest things in the entire picture. Who is this guy? This strange man, bearded, peering out from the doorway, and then he has some other fairly sinister-looking guys in the shadow behind him. Well, what are the characteristics that he has? He has a red cloth wrapped around a seemingly nude figure. He has what looks like thorns, only in metal. This elaborate crown of thorns, but it's a mock crown of thorns. So the thorns aren't actually going to hurt him. And he's holding that crown that I pointed out to you before upside down. And it has these grotesque figures. They're often called toads, but they might just be devils, along the edge. And then he has something very, very strange. It's almost like a transparent cylinder with gold edging that around, like a big ankle bracelet. But it reveals beneath it there's this big sword that's just oozing. What is all that? Well, Lotta Brand Phillips has identified him as the Antichrist. And so she's seen these different attributes as distortion of or an inversion of the attributes of Christ. We know that Christ wears a red cloth at the resurrection and sometimes as the man of sorrows or at the last judgment. So, his opposite here seems to have adopted that. He's wearing a crown of thorns, but he's wearing it like a exotic, lordly crown, and it has no pain to it at all. Sort of the opposite of what Christ's crown of thorn did. And, his other crown has these demonic creatures, which suggest evil. And then what they have suggested with this leg is that this sort of glass or crystalline cylinder reminds people of reliquaries or monstrances. A reliquary where you might show, say, the bone of the saint. You can see it through the glass. And so they suggest that this is a false relic. And, the sore is, of course, something really, disgusting. There you see the two crowns. And you can also see a good look at, as I said, those pretty sinister companions that he has here. And there is that transparent cylinder on his leg. And you might notice there's some more of these grotesque figures on this, I don't know what it is, belt that's hanging down. Okay. We also have shepherds who are climbing up the roof. Now, they peer around the shed. They peer through a hole. Well, sometimes there's a window, and it's a tradition that you often have a shepherd peering through a window into the stable of the Nativity. And so we start wondering, well, why are these guys climbing up on the roof? It looks like the roof might just come down below, collapse or something. Why don't they just come out? Or, maybe they're waiting their turn. Why are they climbing up there? Well, one person might say, looking at this, maybe they're just so eager to see the Christ child. They're not going to wait till those fancy magi are gone, which they have to do because of their social status. So they're climbing up on the roof to get a good view, right away. The other thing is there is a reference and a kind of parable, a sort of a parable like the bad versus the good shepherd, that Christ tells in John, the 10th book. And it talks about people entering not, this is Jesus speaking, he that entereth not by the door into the sheepfold, but climbeth up another way, the same is a thief and a robber. And so Larry Silver suggested that these might be not the good, nice shepherds, but the bad shepherds. In other words, evil is everywhere. And I'll let you decide which it might be. Because, we can't say for certain. They had that spacious landscape, and you saw way, way, way in the back this exotic towers of either Bethlehem or Jerusalem, whichever it's intended to mean. Bethlehem would be closer, but Jerusalem might be bigger city, more exotic looking. And amidst all this, splendor and, original, unusual buildings, we have something quite homey and prosaic, if you will. There's a windmill, which, of course, you would see a lot of windmills in the lowlands. So sort of exotic and homey combined. But even with the presence of the Christ child in the world is still full of sin and evil. And Bosch, I mean, we don't know what he's thinking, but certainly looking at his paintings, we seem to feel that he is quite pessimistic about man's ability to do good. It seems like in all of his paintings, it's just, sin, 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 sin. I apologize, not all of his paintings. There's some of saints, but there's little devils waiting there too. And of course, there's the heaven scenes that he does on the Last Judgments. But just so many of his paintings show in the background or in other places something that suggests evil. And behind the stable, on either side, you have these what look like two armies getting ready to fight each other. And then in the background of the donor wing, way far there, we see peasants dancing. Now, is that just innocent, good fun and showing us this goes on? Or is it supposed to be innocent and they should be spending time on their spiritual matters, not goofing around and playing? And this might lead to lust or sloth or some other terrible sin. And I don't know. You'll remember we saw people dancing in the back of the landloper that was the back of the Haywain triptych. So in Madrid. This is in Madrid too. In fact, probably the same room in the museum. It is a motif that Bosch puts in his paintings. Behind St. Agnes and the donatrix, there's a much more horrific scene. There are wolves who are, killing the man and the woman, presumably going to kill this woman who's fleeing from the wolf. The world is not a pleasant place the way Bosch envisions it. Danger, evil, go on. But if you thought that was a world filled with sinister overtones, wait till you see what St. Anthony had to put up with. This is St. Anthony Abbot. There's a number of St. Anthony's in the list of saints. The other St. Anthony, who is terribly well known, of course, is St. Anthony of Padua, a Franciscan saint, who is the patron saint of lost things. This is a different St. Anthony. This is the St. Anthony Abbot. He was a hermit saint and an ascetic saint, the kind of person that goes off in the wilderness and tries to get away from people and mortifies the flesh. But he did found a monastery, so he's associated with the Antonite order. And he had terrible problems. You may remember when we talked about this with Schongauer, and you saw the temptation or the torment, really, of St. Anthony. You're going to see that again here. Anthony, his life story, he is subjected to attacks by devils over and over again. Sometimes he's tempted by them, sometimes he's just abused by them. And this is just filled with devils, and imaginatively as Bosch can think of them, I guess. There's another version of it. When I was looking for the exterior, I found one picture where it was just so dark you could barely see anything. And I found another picture that was all brightly colored. And I know this is supposed to be monochromatic, but I'm not sure how monochromatic. So I just decided to make the best image into grayscale and use it there. As I say, I know it is supposed to be monochromatic, but I don't know if I think there's more color in it than just the gray, black and white. This is the exterior of the St. Anthony Abbot triptych. If you fold the wings over, what you would see during, say, the weekdays, and then you can open it on the feast day of the saint or on Sunday Mass or whenever you're doing it. And here you see we have the arrest of Christ. And down in the foreground, St. Peter is about to cut the ear off the soldier. And then on the other side, also in a deep landscape, We have the carrying of the cross, only Christ has now just arrived at Golgotha, evidently. And then in the foreground, we have the priest trying to give confession and the last rites to the two thieves that were crucified with Christ. And one of them is seated there listening very intently to what the priest is saying. And the other one, probably not. He seems to be a little arrogant about it. And remember that they talk about the good thief and the bad thief. The good thief asks Christ to pray for him. Christ says that today you will be with me in my kingdom. He believes in Christ. And the other one mocks him. Okay, left wing. Up in the sky, you can see poor Saint Anthony has been carried up into the sky with these hybrid monstrous devils. And he's still praying hard. And you might notice he has a little cross, a little T-shaped cross on his cloak, which is the type of cross that's often associated with St. Anthony. And so the devils took him up in the air and they, terrorized him, and then they threw him back down to the earth. And so what we're seeing next is that other brothers and a person who's dressed more like the townsman in red are carrying poor injured Anthony back to his cell. It has been suggested that the man resembles somewhat that picture that we have that's supposed to be the portrait of Hieronymus Bosch, and that it might be Bosch putting his own features in this painting, showing him helping the saint. We don't know. That's a question mark. And just to show you what some of these little devils look like, this one is the postman devil, or is he sometimes called the messenger devil. He's got a bird's, sort of malformed bird's beak that he can stick a letter through. He's got a funnel for a hat. He wears a badge of a messenger, and he's got these long ears, and I've been trying to figure out where did those come from? What are they? They're shoes or slippers. Okay. I was thinking of animals, but they can be other objects as well. And he's skating. I mean, this is the Netherlands. They like to skate. It's one of their national pastimes. Okay, so we see this little guy skating on the water, which is frozen. I don't know what message he's bringing. And then in the background, we see this giant fish in this red shell, which seems to be both constructed, but it has sort of legs like a praying mantis, and a tail that is purely fanciful, and a warrior is riding it. So he seems to be armored, and either that's a wheel or a shield next to him. So maybe he goes rolling along. And then there is a tower up above. So you think of elephants wearing sort of towers that people sit on them. Well, here it is that this strange creature. And the big fish, as you can see, is devouring a smaller fish. And there is a Netherlandish proverb, we'll hear about that again, that says, the big fish eats the little fish. And you can pretty much figure out what that means. That people of wealth or power, the big fish, kind of do what they want with those who have none. The center shows a kind of satanic mass, a mass that's inverted. And devils and other figures seem to be celebrating it. And so here you have saint trying to go to mass, and instead it's been taken over by these horrible devils. The whole world is filled with devils. Now, there is a place where the devils don't go. And if you follow where the saint is pointing, go into the back, there is this somewhat dark room, which is presumably a chapel. And we'll see a detail of it shortly. There you can see. Here's the saint is sort of he's either blessing or he's pointing, but it's gesturing toward Christ at what you might say a true altar that contrasts with this satanic altar that is further forward. So, despite all the temptations and the distractions, the saint remains calm, and he's showing us where Christ is. He's looking to us, and he's pointing the way. Amid all the temptations of the world, this is what you can rely on. And here we've blown it up a little bit. It's quite small, so it's somewhat generalized. But you have Christ standing by the altar. He's got the two fingers, he's blessing, but he's also pointing to the crucifix. And you'll remember that on the altar, the crucifixion was reenacted, and it makes merits for the souls of whoever the Mass is directed to, for the souls of mankind. In other words, it's efficacious, or it works. There is a burning candle, sort of the light in the dark world here, the world that's dark with sin. But Christ is at the altar offering to redeem those who come. Here's it again. And some of the details. These figures have been given different names. Sometimes the woman is considered to be a pagan priestess or something like that. And you can see some of these creatures that are made up of different animal and plant forms coming in. This is the demonic priest. He's got a kind of animal-like head, and his garment is torn open, and we can see that he indeed is skeletal. You can see his ribs, his viscera are pouring out. It's kind of distressing. And then the demon with the big mouth open, what is he doing? Is he distorting the words of the service, or making some horrible noise rather than sacred music? On either side, you also have groups of figures who seem to be riding. Well, they're not riding horses. One of them is riding a kind of looks like a plucked chicken, but with a weird head. The head, actually, it looks almost like an open mouth, and then a little head is popping out of it. And he's got the little pattens, the little wooden shoes, and the creature on top of him has some knightly armor and a green veil or cloak, but a head that is a skull of some kind of animal with a pointed snout. And he's making music. Another one behind him, be shouting. And of course, you have these great fruit or berry-like forms that they're coming out of. On the other side, we have the bottle with legs and the hybrid armored figure. And then the figure that causes a lot of people to look at this, the mother and child. Only, is she made out of tree roots or another kind of root? What is she? And she's riding a rat. One of the suggestions is made that because the satanic mass makes things inverts things from the true mass, makes them go backwards. That this is a kind of parody of the flight into Egypt. And Lorinda Dixon and some other people have suggested that the figure is a mandrake root, which was believed to have a kind of human form. And mandrake was sometimes used as medicine for the disease of St. Anthony's fire, ergotism, which we talked about before in relationship to a hospital picture. And Lorinda Dixon has seen some alchemical and possibly medicinal symbols within this painting. So some people agree with it, and some people say no. This isn't a hospital painting, or we don't know that it is. So some very strange going-ons here. And then, of course, we hear about the fires of hell. Well, supposedly this is the world, but it looks like it's burning up also. Now, the last, the right side, shows Anthony seated there with an open book, and he's sort of hunched over and has his cloak up, almost like he's trying to, hide himself away, maybe get some privacy. Maybe there's too many devils around bothering him. The one devil that's right in front of him, it seems to be emerging from this split tree, is this beautiful woman in the water. And there were occasions, legend tells us, in which he was tempted by beautiful women who turned out to be devils. One of them was called the Queen of the Nile. And so she's in the water, so maybe that's who she is. You see all of these little monstrous forms. It occurs to me that this panel seems to have lust and gluttony going on, and probably a few other things as well, because you have, I'll show you some other details. You have this fat man, gluttony maybe, with this woman riding the fish in the sky, which is a motif that you see sometimes in popular art. This is a real flying fish. I mean, it seems to be flying. And then this creature, devil, presumably, which is just a big belly without features, just ears and legs, and it's pierced with a knife. And, once again, I think of something like gluttony with the big fat belly and the knife going into it. But at any rate, monstrous devils, how can he make them up? What can he... People love to look at these things. When you go to the Prado, you can't get close to some of the paintings because there's so many people who are trying to say, look at that, what's that mean? This is a painting that is in Ghent, in the Museum of Fine Arts in Ghent. And it's a panel of Christ carrying the cross, or the way of the cross. And as you can see, it's got lots and lots and lots of heads. And it gives you the feeling that you're in this crowd, that you're right close to everybody. You're being squashed into the crowd, and you're being pushed up against other people. So this is it's supposed to aid you in a kind of participatory devotion. The composition itself is cross-shaped. You can see the cross that Christ is carrying that goes from the upper left to the lower right, hidden behind some of the figures, but it's implied. And then you have a kind of implied diagonal the other way for the good people, the good thief, Christ in the center, and Saint Veronica in the lower left. Now take a look at all of those people. One of the figures, which you can barely see, it looks like he's straining to hold the cross, and we've seen this foreshortened view, is Simon of Cyrene, who was drafted to help Christ carry his cross. And then there is this sort of serene, calm figure of Saint Veronica, and you can see she's holding up her pseudorim, or her veil, that has been impressed with the face of Christ, and she's turning away from this mob. Now, it was very common to show evil by distortion and ugliness, and Bosch certainly did that. These figures are caricatures. Not almost, some of them are definitely caricatures, and all of that evil and distortion is supposed to make you realize how evil these people are. These are the two thieves. I gave it away. I was going to say, can you tell which one is good and which one is the bad thief? Which is the one, who accepted Christ and repented, and which is the one who just mocked him and said, we're just going to be dying tortured, horrible death. Well, kind of easy, because you can do it, if nothing else, by process of elimination, because the lower right, the bad thief is, snarling at his persecutors, and they're persecutors, all right. They're mocking him, and he's giving back what they're getting. The good thief looks, what he's not retaliating. He's looks horrified, but there's certainly made a difference between the two. And Christ right in the center. He's the calm, stable center with all of these horrible, grotesque faces of the tormentors around him.
The most frequent themes of Hieronymus Bosch's paintings are the follies and the sins of mankind, and he's famous for painting the monstrous devils and the high-bred creatures. The most famous of his paintings is known as the Garden of Earthly Delights. Now, we don't know what Bosch called it. That is a conventional name that has been given to it. So when you say the Garden of Earthly Delights or even the Garden of Delights, people will know which of Bosch paintings you refer to. As we will see, the iconography is very controversial. Now, first, I just wanted you to take a little look at the right wing of this painting. It's a triptych. And this shows the hell scene, and it's here to illustrate all of these monstrous devils and creatures here. You have the total image, and then you have this detail of the lower part, and you can see Satan on a potty chair, as it were, eating, devouring sinners and defecating them down into a cesspool. And you can see the musicians literally hung up on their instruments. So you have also a sense of that he's trying to create this feeling of smell and sound as well as sight. Now, why would musicians be tormented like that? Well, it was believed that the musicians who accompanied song or who played musical instruments such as the lute or the harp, that they often put people in a lascivious mood. You think about the troubadour singing love songs or someone having the musicians playing as they meet their lover. Church music was primarily plain song with no musical accompaniment. So presumably, these musicians abated in the sin of lust. This is the painting, the Garden of Earthly Delights. And as you can see, it's laid out as a triptych. The left wing, or left side panel, is the Garden of Eden. And then in the center, there's this very unusual scene. There's nothing else like it in the history of art, with all of these nude people cavorting. That's the word I tend to use. And you have giant plants and pods and strange structures, and we'll be talking about some of those. And then the scene that you just saw on the right, the hell scene. Well, let's start talking about the style and composition first. As you can see, it's laid out with a very clearly distinct foreground, middle ground, background, and even a very far distant background with these hazy blue mountains. But it also extremely high horizon. And with all the little figures and objects going on throughout the panel, it sometimes gives a feeling of a kind of overall surface pattern if you stand back and look at it. It's been compared almost to a tapestry. And here's a little detail so you can see some of the figures. All these figures look almost identical. You've got male figures, you've got female figures, and you have a few African figures. But we tend to think of them almost like little dolls because they have very little shading. So they don't have that volumetric chiaroscuro, but they do turn in space. As you can see, they can be in all sorts of different poses. closer. Okay, I said there was controversial iconography. And there are numerous interpretations of this, and I'm just listing a few of them. We're going to talk more about the moral lesson, the moral interpretation, the heretical interpretation, and the alchemical interpretation. But here's just a list. The oldest and longest running, if you will, interpretation has been an interpretation based on the idea that this has a moral message. You know, that's a kind of moral lesson about what you should not be doing. Another idea is that it shows the people before Noah's flood. And on the exterior, it shows the flood of Noah. And we'll be looking at that as well as the interior. The idea is that you have, the Garden of Eden, and then in the center, people sinning. And of course, these people all go to hell. And then on the outside, you have an image, as we will see, of the world. And that interpretation thinks this is Noah's flood. Now, we do have a painting by Bosch or attributed to Bosch of Noah's flood, and it doesn't quite look like that at all. Another interpretation, which I'm going to talk to you about, is this idea that this was a heretical altarpiece. And then there have been many alchemical interpretations. But there's one that has emerged, it was a dissertation of 1980, and it was presented at a conference in 1980, and it was published in 1981. And I'm going to talk to you about that one because it was a different kind of allegorical, it was a different kind of alchemical allegory. And a fairly recently published book has suggested that this scene in the center represents the golden age of mankind, when shepherds and nymphs just lived in peace and harmony, and they made music and they made love and they had fun in the sunshine. And I guess the sheep and goats took care of themselves. There aren't really, I think there's a goat in there, but not sure about any sheep. But anyway, that's a recent interpretation. Now, these are the three interpretations I'm going to talk to you about. I think that there's probably most truth in the moral and the alchemical ideas about what's going on here. I should tell you one thing. I think we've mentioned Erwin Panofsky before, the great iconographer of Renaissance art. And when he wrote his book on early Netherlandish painting, he ended it with Bosch. And what he said was that he wasn't going to do an interpretation of Bosch's Garden of Delights or his work. He said, it's too high for my wit. And when you hear that, you think, oh my goodness, why would anybody tackle it? Well, obviously, many, many scholars have tackled it, even if Panofsky was reluctant to take it on. So the first interpretation I'm going to talk to you about, and I'm going to say something that I rarely say. This is wrong. And I can prove it. Now, there may be times when I disagree with an interpretation, and I'll point that out. But I might, find something, or I might understand why they thought that that particular meaning was attached to a particular painting. But in this case, I find it a little more difficult. But so why am I talking to you about it? Well, I'm talking to you about it because it pops up in popular literature, newspaper articles, when people hear this, and they just repeat it without knowing what the evidence is. Okay, this was an interpretation. It was published in articles and books by Franginger. And Franginger thought that the Garden of Delights was an altarpiece for a heretical cult, which was called the Adamites, or the Brethren of the Free Spirit. Now, why do I say this is false? Well, it's ahistorical. The Adamites did not live in the time of Hieronymus Bosch. They were a century earlier. The last time they were heard of was in Brussels in 1416. And that's when they're heard of. It's a heresy trial, and it's the records for the heresy trial. And during this trial, they are accused of practicing free love. And that's probably what Franger latched on to. He thought all these people in the center who were cavorting were practicing free love. And so it must be the Adamites. But the Adamites were never in Hertogenbosch. And the last mention was that heresy trial of 1416. Now, Hieronymus Bosch died in 1516. And, we have the drawing from the Codex Aureus where he looks to be an old man. But I think it's beyond possibility that he was old enough to have been an adult and practicing heresy in 1416. I doubt that he was even a glimmer in his father's eye in 1416. It just seems beyond credulity. Okay, what other evidence would we have besides, wait, it's the wrong time and place? Every indication suggests that Bosch was a faithful Christian. He was not a heretic, and there was no hint of heresy attached to him or his work. And the reason I say that is because what do we know about him? Well, we know that he was a member of the confraternity of Our Lady of the Snow. Now, this was a prestigious confraternity. A confraternity is a religious organization that takes lay people. I suppose the closest equivalent we have today might be something like the Knights of Columbus for the Catholics, or the Masons, and the Eastern Star for the women, for the Protestants. But essentially, it's a religious organization. It's made up primarily of lay people, and they're very orthodox. There's no flirting with heresy in these confraternities. Also, Bosch received commissions from his local church. Now, we know that many of those, they don't survive, let's put it that way. But the fact that he received the commissions suggests that there was no hint of heresy attached. The penalty for heresy was death. And there's no indication of that at all. And I don't see Bosch painting for heretics, no matter how much they were willing to pay him. Also, we know something about who may have owned this painting. The Count of Nassau owned it in 1517. Now, that's Nassau in the Netherlands, not the Caribbean island. And then it went to the collection, eventually, to the collection of the King of Spain, Philip II. Now, you may know about Philip II. The Inquisition was very, very strong under Philip II. If there was a hint of heresy about someone, they would be tortured and executed. Even conversos, people who had converted from Judaism or Islam, were under great suspicion. And if they were found to relapse, of course, they were considered, I say of course, a lot of these people were just simply forcibly baptized, and then now you're a Christian, and if you relapse, you're a heretic. Well, that's horrifying to us today. On other occasions, someone may have sincerely converted, but if their parents had been Muslim or their parents had been Jewish, they were liable to receive the attention of the Inquisition. And the King of Spain was the great supporter and promoter of the Spanish Inquisition. If he had owned paintings that he suspected might have the hint of heresy, those paintings would have been burnt. And so we sincerely doubt that he regarded these jewels of his collection as heretical, or even suspected such a thing about them. In 1600, this painting was owned by the King of Spain. And it's from that period that we have the very first written interpretation that has survived. Now, this was written by Fra Jose de Siguenza, and he doesn't call the painting the Garden of Earthly Delights. That comes much, much later, centuries later. What he calls the painting is the strawberry plant. Now, you can kind of see why. If you're standing in front of that painting, it's hanging on the wall, and we don't know how high it was hanging, but down in the lower part of the painting, I have this little detail here of the people with the giant berries, and one person chomping on a strawberry, and another berry that's open and spilling out its fruit or its seeds. That's very prominent. That's right there up in front. So it must have impressed him. And he gives the whole painting the name, the strawberry plant. But why? Well, he tells us. He says that when you eat a strawberry, when you take a bite, it is so sweet. But shortly thereafter, it has no taste. The taste doesn't last. And he uses this to make a kind of analogy between the strawberry plant, which has sweet taste, but it just doesn't last, and the transitory nature of sensual pleasures, because fairly obviously there are sensual pleasures going on in the central panel of this painting. There's sexual activity, there's eating of giant fruits, there's a lot of cavorting going on, as we might say. Now, this is, and he's very clear about, this is a vanitas theme. Okay, what's that mean? Well, vanitas is a Latin word for vanity. And of course, in English, vanity means a lot of things. It means somebody, you're full of pride of your appearance. Or we have a piece of furniture that we call a vanity, where women sit at and put on makeup. Actually, the word for pride was superbia, and was, of course, one of the 7 deadly sins, superbia. Vanitas refers to verses in Ecclesiastes. And in Ecclesiastes, the prophet names various things in the world. And then he says, I'm paraphrasing, obviously, it's useless, you're just going to die. And there's a repeated refrain of vanity, vanity, all is vanity. One of them, incidentally, is about much study is a trouble. It's difficult. And even if you get this, scholarly perfection, you're just gonna die. You can't take it with it. You can't take it with you, is how we might put it today. So all things of the world are in vain. It's pretty depressing, actually. However, the way the Christians interpreted that book of the Bible was that all worldly things are in vain. And then they felt the implication was that spiritual matters you could take with you. That all these worldly things, they profited you nothing in the long run. You have to put your mind on spiritual matters in order to go to heaven. And the worldly matters will just lead you straight to hell. Now, vanitas themes are very prevalent in the history of art. When you're at the 17th century, for example, not in this course, but perhaps in a Baroque course, you'll be seeing vanitas still lifes, in which you would have images of various things, such as fruit, which might, slightly be turning a little too ripe, fruit will decay soon. It's transitory. Or flowers which are drooping, or little insects, or mice, or something like this that could eat away, represent time. Hourglasses are frequent, even skulls sometimes in them. So there's a lot of different ways that artists will tell you that transitory nature of human pleasure, that all of the pleasures of life and the pleasures of the senses simply don't last. You've got to think about spiritual things. Vanity, vanity, all is vanity. So that is how he interpreted it. And you see the image with the strawberries, the big fruit down here in the foreground. Okay, that is the oldest interpretation. And, for many centuries, including today, that is a prevailing interpretation. We may not call it strawberry plant, but the moral interpretation certainly seems to be the one that you would look at when you see it. I mean, you do have hell there. It does seem to suggest something. So what I'm going to show you first is the moral interpretation. Now, we don't have time to go into every single figure, object, animal, plant in this painting. I'm just going to show you a few representative samples. Now, one of the people who has written widely on this is Walter Gibson. He's written a book on Hieronymus Bosch. He's written an article on Bosch's Garden of Delights. Jim Snyder also used the moral interpretation when he wrote his book on Hieronymus Bosch. So it's a very prevalent viewpoint. And, it's very clear, actually, in a sense, because you look at the right panel and you see Eden. And it kind of looks like Adam is being introduced to Eve. We'll take a closer look at that image, of course. Then you go on, and in the center you have nude figures cavorting. Presumably this means that sinful mankind is progressing from Eden, where human beings first came into being, and they start sinning, and they continue to sin. So there they are, their sinful existence on earth. And where does it lead them? They just end up in the right panel, hell. Walter Gibson pointed out that we have another painting by Hieronymus Bosch, which is laid out in a very similar way. And by historical coincidence, it is also in the same room in the Museo del Prado in Madrid. Of course, the Prado was the royal palace of the kings of Spain, also the Escorial. So much of the art collection of the kings of Spain is now the basis of the Prado Museum. And they have a Bosch room. And in that room are a number of paintings, including these two. Okay, what is this other painting? It's called the Hay Wain Triptych. A hay wain looks like, a hay wain means a hay wagon. And so right there in the front, you see a hay wagon. So as I say, it's laid out in a very similar fashion. You have a triptych. On the left wing, you have scenes of the Garden of Eden. They're a little bit different, as you can see, but you have Adam and Eve going through the whole story of the earliest sections of Genesis. And then you have this strange center that seems to call for some kind of iconographic interpretation. And you just can't take that one by saying, oh yeah, I saw that the other day. It's an unusual scene in the middle. And then on the right, just like in the Garden of Delights, you see hell. And there's no doubt that that is hell, with the burning city and the horrible devils. Okay. The point is that this painting is much easier to interpret than the Garden of Delights, because we have essentially the key. In the center, you have a hay wagon, right? And you have people grabbing for hay, trying to get all the hay they can. Well, there is a Netherlandish proverb. They love proverbs in the Netherlands. And the proverb goes, all the world's a haystack, and everyone grabs from it what he can. So all those worldly things, everybody wants them. They want more money. They want more power. They want more sex. They want these worldly things. They want more food and drink and, whatever they want. And everyone is grabbing what he can. Now, this has also been related to a verse in the Bible from Isaiah. It says, all flesh is grass. The idea that, like grass, human existence in the physical form, all flesh, can be just burnt up in a second. It talks about the grass, which just burns up and is gone. And that's like the life of man. You're there a brief moment and it's over. You're gone. Both of them, reflect what? Something that is transitory, something people may want very much. And let's see what happens. Okay, so all the world's a haystack. All those worldly pleasures and desires like power and wealth and lust and food and drink. I mean, you have to have a certain amount to live, but, excessive food and drink, let's say, are worthless. They're nothing but hay. They're not going to get you into heaven. They're not going to help you when you die. They're nothing but hay. Essentially a worthless thing. Use it for bedding down animals. So that is, in many ways, a vanitas theme. So we have another vanitas here. Well, let's take a closer look at what's going on here. In the left wing, at the very top, we see God the Father and the fall of the rebel angels. Now, that's not in the Bible. That's comes from other sources. But is the idea that some of the angels, Satan was the leader, rebelled against God's authority. And they were cast out of heaven and they became the devils. And then you see human existence with the very first parents. So you have here in the background the creation of Eve. She's rising out of the side of Adam, out of his rib, as it were. And then, a little further down, you see original sin, the fall of man, where Satan tempts human beings and they eat from the forbidden fruit. The one thing God had told them not to do was to eat of the tree of knowledge. So now they know both good and evil. And they are expelled from paradise. And so here's the angel chasing them out of paradise. It looks like Adam may be objecting a bit. Eve, her hand is to her cheek in distress, is looking right into the next panel as, okay, that's where we've got to go next, maybe. The next panel, the all the world's a haystack panel, has this very, very prominent hay wagon. You'll notice who's pulling it are these devils, these little monsters, and they are literally pulling it right into the next scene, the hell scene. But you have people who are grabbing at that hay. They are fighting everybody for the hay. One person's murdering somebody right down here in the lower, just beyond the basic foreground between the people in the foreground and the hay wagon itself. You have somebody down on the ground murdering somebody for the hay. There's one guy who's got his hay, and he's right under the wheel. He's going to be crushed under the wheel the next moment. Down in the foreground, you have all of these nuns pulling up all this hay to feed to this very corpulent monk. And this is probably a commentary on the gluttony and loose ways that some of the clergy were supposed to participate. Well, they weren't supposed to participate in it, were believed to participate. And there are all sorts of stories in the
14th century and the 15th century, and I'm sure on, about monks who did not follow their vows. They were corpulent, they were lustful, they did all the sinning. But here, of course, we can see that, maybe that feast that's going to be laid out for him will be nothing but hay. And then you see the quack doctor. That's another way of getting your hay, getting your money. The little group of women there, not quite sure about that. It's been suggested that they may be gypsies, who are famous for chicanery. When you're in Europe, watch your pocketbook, or if gypsies are around. At any rate, we have all these sort of ordinary people trying to get that hay. But if you look who's following the hay wagon, who are assured of hay, these are the wealthy and powerful. There's a pope and kings and dukes and just all of the wealthy and the powerful on their horses following the hay, because that's what they are most interested in. Not spiritual matters, but what? Power, wealth, hay. Nothing but hay. Okay. Now, at the very top, you see Jesus. He's up there in the clouds. We'll take a little closer look at him. And on the top of the hay wagon, we have a little scene of a garden of love. And you can see there's a bush growing there. There's one of those sinful musicians making music to sort of help the couples in their amorous dalliance. So you have two sets of lovers, a musician, and you'll notice that the little devil with them is literally piping them to hell with the pipe is made of it. The pipe is made out of his nose. So it's this long pipe. He's piping them away. And, there's only one figure in this entire composition before you get up to Jesus that seems to be having any spiritual, any interest in spiritual matters, and that is this little angel. And he is praying so hard as he looks up to Christ. He's just there on his knees praying for these people. Okay. So here we see them, the angels looking up, praying for them. They are completely ignoring Jesus. And he's shown as a man of sorrows. He's displaying his wounds. He's looking down from heaven at sinful mankind saying, I died for your sins. Excuse me, I'm up here. You really should behave better. Whatever. He's calling attention to the fact that he died to save them. And yet they're still pursuing the hay. Those things which will only bring them to hell, not to heaven. So, comparing the two, in both there's Eden, where mankind begins to sin. In the center, mankind is continuing to sin. In the Garden of Delights, they are having giant fruit and lots of erotic activities. And then in both of these paintings, the right wing is hell, where mankind is punished for his sin. So Walter Gibson and many others, believe that this is, you might say, the key to the Garden of Delights. That we have man comes into being, he sins, and he ends up in hell. And here's another example. This is one of the details. They call this the cavalcade, and as you can see, the nude men in Bosch's painting are riding all of these different kinds of animals. And they seem to be trying to attract the attention of the lovely ladies who are bathing in the nude. They're skinny dipping in the pond. Water is often considered to be what St. Jerome says about moist places are symbols of lust. And a lot of these different animals do have associations with sins. Because of a verse in Isaiah that says that every man neighed after his neighbor's wife. Horses are sometimes considered to be lustful creatures. Goats, of course, you probably know that, are associated with lust and even with the devil. They have some great cats here that might be lions or some other type of wild, ferocious animal. Those might be associated with choler,
and anger and wrath. Pretty much different names for the same thing. Pigs, of course, were associated with gluttony. Stags also sometimes associated with lust. And then some of them are just exotic beasties. Now, look down at this pretty crude woodcut. It's a late 15th century German woodcut. And it represents the 7 deadly sins, all on different animals, carrying banners which show other different animals, and they're following Satan. Now, in this case, the sins are female. And I should also, in full disclosure, tell you that some of these books also have virtues as female figures riding on animals. But as you can see, you have this idea of the sins following Satan, on these exotic beasties, and this seems to be a kind of parallel to what you see in Bosch's painting. Here we look at it again. There is, that seems to be very clear, and it seems to be a really straightforward interpretation in many ways. When you get into the details, it gets really, intriguing, if you will. There's one thing, though, that makes you wonder just a little bit if that's all there is to it. If this was showing you sinful mankind, why, in the Garden of Eden, are you not showing the fall of man? Wouldn't that make the point really strong? So, is it just that when man came into being, we know that they're going to be sinning, and we can see they're sinning, and we can see they go to hell here? Or is there some other reason for that? Well, in 1980, I went to the College Art Association meeting, which was held that year in New Orleans. And there was a paper given by Lorinda Dixon. She was just receiving her doctorate from Boston University, and she is now a professor at Syracuse University. And she had a most intriguing interpretation for Hieronymus Bosch. The next year, her dissertation book came out, and in the Art Bulletin of 1981, the March edition, was her article about this. Now, there had been other alchemical interpretations before Lorinda Dixon. Most of them, would be the idea of alchemists as evildoers, who are so interested in trying to change lead into gold that, they neglect spiritual matters, this kind of thing. When we think of alchemists today, that's kind of what we think of. Oh, alchemy. They're trying to change lead into gold. They're greedy. And also they're mad scientists. That's actually the television idea of mad scientists, I think, does come from the idea of the alchemist who's just obsessed, with his alchemy, and does go mad, because one of the elements that alchemists used very frequently was mercury, particularly red mercury. And red mercury is poisonous, and it will drive you mad. It will have a very bad effect on your brain, and that it will kill you. So there are some recorded alchemists who, died from their fascination with alchemy. Okay, well, that's the bad alchemists. Lorinda Dixon points out that there's another side of alchemy. Now, because they're good alchemists, maybe. For one thing, she calls alchemy a fossil science. In other words, it kind of died out, it fossilized. It didn't lead directly to chemistry. It's in some ways like chemistry. You're mixing things together. You heat them up. They don't use Bunsen burners. They use other fires, but they use very similar vessels. Some things even look like test tubes, and other vessels that seem similar to perhaps modern chemistry. Although, as I say, that's not a direct link. It's what she calls a fossil science. But she defined alchemy a little bit differently than our conventional approach. She pointed out that alchemy was supposed to be, really was the science of distillation. And it was very much related to medieval medicine. And you had people who were, you might call them the good alchemists. How do you use distillation, not to change lead into gold, but to make medicines, for example? And so this would be, our apothecary. You'll remember that Bosch's in-laws were apothecaries. They were, what we today we call pharmacists or chemists. Also, in most places, the St. Luke's Guild was the guild of the painters, the physicians, and the apothecaries. So Bosch wouldn't have had any problem, if he was interested at all, in getting information about alchemy. Presumably, if it's in there, it would be something that the patron wanted as well. Now, what do we mean by the science of distillation? The idea was that if you could distill things, you could get their essence, really strong infusions of whatever you're distilling. And there was also an idea of transmuting or changing one substance into another. And as I said, it's related to medieval medicine. Medieval medicine is based on the 4 humors. You'll remember those. Melancholic. If you've got too much black bile, you're melancholic. If you've got too much yellow bile, you're choleric, angry all the time. If you've got too much phlegm, that attacks the lungs. And you're tired, you're slothful. And, if blood is dominant in your makeup, you're sanguine. And, you might be a little much too hail fellow well met, which is probably the best of the imbalances of humors to have as far as life on Earth. Of course, the problem with being sanguine is you might forget about, the future after you're dead. The idea was that when Adam and Eve first sinned, that original sin brought what? Sin and death into the world. It also brought disease, because disease was caused by an imbalance of your humors. Before man sinned, his humors were in perfect balance. He would live forever. He would never have any illness. Everything would be peace and harmony. But when mankind sinned, when Adam and Eve first sinned, they threw their humors out of whack. And the idea was that you could cure disease if you could find a better balance of humors. So, I'll just give you an example. Everything was believed to be hot or cold, dry or moist. These 4s that you have, 4 things, 4 elements, 4 humors, and as you can see, sort of 4 characteristics of those, of the objects in the world. Now, if you had, let's say, a really hot fever, you're just burning up, you're dry, you're hot, you obviously need an infusion of something that is cold and moist. I mean, today we'd say get plenty of bed rest, drink lots of fluids, cool and moist, and drink lots of orange juice, which is cold and moist. So, kind of makes some sense, huh? Now, if you want to create a pill out of this, or something to drink, some kind of medicine, the apothecary would take something that was cold and moist and put them together and try to distill out, the essence of this cold and moistness. Now, obviously, oranges would work really well. They would have been quite expensive in the Netherlands, having to come from either Spain or Italy or Portugal. But also, of course, as we know, lots of things that were used during the Middle Ages were not what we would consider healthful. They even had ideas like, they would grind up or dissolve pearls for this is the very, 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 very wealthy, as you can imagine, to drink as we might take a pill. Some things just didn't work. Some things did, though. I mean, because they did sometimes, they knew something about what we would call herbal medicine. And that might be the hausfrau, the housewife who knows how to make medicine for her family. Or it could be the apothecary, who professionally makes medicine. Now, these would be the people that would be considered to be the virtuous alchemists. They're distilling medicines. And then you go even, and if you could find the perfect medicine, the panacea, the one that will cure all illness would be the panacea. Or what Lorinda Dixon talks about is the elixir of life. Now, probably most apothecaries, most housewives, most people who are practicing alchemy didn't think that they might someday discover the elixir of life. But for those who hoped to, this idea that we could restore mankind to his pre-sinful condition and to health and, to sinlessness. If you could just find that proper, complete medicine that put everything in balance, could they distill the elixir of life? No one would ever suffer, no one would ever die, no one would prey on each other. Everybody would be virtuous and disease-free and immortal. Okay. One of the things that was so convincing about Lorinda Dixon's argument was that she would take details from Hieronymus Bosch's Garden of Delights and place them next to details of woodcuts or manuscript illustrations from books on alchemy or books on health. And that was what was so convincing about the argument, that you could see the visual elements. You didn't have to say, oh boy, this is really obscure. Say, well, yeah, that does look a lot like it in cruder form. Now, alchemical texts often use symbolic language and symbolic images to describe the process of distillation. We might say, put two things together, heat well. They would have symbolic names. And that way, it was like hidden from those who weren't in the know. It also makes them feel so much smarter. If you use big words, you feel so much smaller than if you say the same thing clearly and with maybe less pretentious vocabulary, perhaps. And the illustrations often do look remarkably like Bosch images. In her dissertation, Dixon has 90-some of these parallels. So I'm going to show you very, very few of them. There's a lot more. Okay, first, let's look at the Garden of Delights, the scene of Eden. And as you can see, you have this lovely vista. You have some exotic animals back there in the middle ground. You see an elephant. You see a giraffe. Incidentally, those two animals are taken from a travel book. We know where he copied it from, actually. He'd never seen an elephant or a giraffe. Then there are the unicorns whose horns are purifying the water, which does make you think of, something that's a healing elixir, doesn't it? And we'll take a closer look at this. There's what's sometimes called the fountain, this strange device in the middle of the pond, right there in the center of the panel. And then if we look at the foreground, we see
and we'll take a closer look at this, we see this pool with these creatures climbing out of them. Very strange creatures. The primal pool, sometimes called. And there is a dragon tree. You may remember that from Schongauer's flight into Egypt. And beneath the dragon tree sits Adam. And in the center is Christ. And he has Eve by her wrist. And some people say what he's doing is introducing Eve to Adam. Or it's sometimes called the marriage of Adam and Eve. Now, let me talk about Christ just a little bit. Some of you say, well, shouldn't it be God the Father? Actually, the earliest images of Genesis that are known show a beardless figure with a nimmed halo, in other words, a halo with a cross in it. And those are actually copies of a manuscript that was burned in the 17th century, the Cotton Genesis. And then there are later medieval manuscripts and mosaics that show the Garden of Eden, and we believe that they're based on probably early Christian manuscripts that now have perished. Some things like the Granville Bible, which is a 9th century Bible, or one of the domes in the narthex at San Marcos seems to have as its source a early Christian Bible, maybe the 4th or 5th century, that is very close to this lost cotton Genesis. But of course, we're dealing with copies. At any rate, in many of these, in most of these, it is Christ who is creating in the Garden of Eden. And if you think about it, well, the Creed says that Christ is co-eternal with the Father. Also, he is one substance with the Father. So, they are joined. You have them both at once, in a sense. Also, how did creation occur? God spoke. He gave the order. And Jesus in the Bible is called the Word, or the Verbum, or the Logos. Verbum being Latin, Logos being Greek. And the Word came and dwelt among us. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God. So the idea that God created by the Word, who is identified with Christ, was evidently much on the minds of those who created early Genesis scenes. And so here we do have a figure that you could call it God, you could call him Christ, and he's wearing sort of a, we might say a pink or rose garment. Lorinda called it red. Red is the fully saturated rose. Rose is a light red, essentially, or pink is a light red with white in it. And she notes that even his face is ruddy. And she points out that for alchemists, that red mercury was sometimes identified with Christ, and they thought that red mercury could make this transmutation occur. They thought that this was a catalyst, and they actually identified it symbolically with Christ. So she thinks this is a little suggests that we may be dealing with alchemy here. There's a lot of other ones in the book. In fact, let's look at this. This is what we call the primal pool, in which you have all of these little hybrid creatures. Now, these aren't devils. They're not acting like devils. That's just why we can say they're not devils. We don't think they're devils. But they just seem to be little creatures that are made up of different parts of other creatures. Here's this little seahorse unicorn, for example, or something that looks almost like a platypus. And you'll notice the three-headed bird. Well, the three-headed bird appears frequently in alchemical literature and pictures. So, it's been called the alchemical bird. And some of those figures, particularly those three right around our seahorse, unicorn, and horse, resemble very much some figures of sort of crude woodcuts that you find in health texts and alchemical texts. I always look at this and I think of evolution. Evolution, what Darwin was centuries and centuries later. But you do have this little figure, crawling out of the primal pool to walk on land, and figures that seem to be developing limbs and wings and, all sorts of things. It's
It's almost like the early stages of creation. We're trying a few things. Okay, so the left panel has been called the marriage of Adam and Eve. And that name, the marriage of Adam and Eve, in alchemical allegory, is the name of the first step of the process of distillation. When you're putting two disparate elements together in your container, say in your beaker, whatever you're using. And this little black and white drawing is from an alchemical manuscript. And you can see here that Christ is, what, the red mercury? He's marrying Adam and Eve. He's joining them. And what are Adam and Eve? Well, the first thing you do is to take two different things. You know, we're talking about hot, cold, warm, moist. These things that are opposites. And you're putting them together in the beaker. You're going to try to make an amalgamation that completely and perfectly marries them together. Like those two very different things of male and female, Adam and Eve, are being wedded, joined, here literally joined at the hip in the alchemical image. You also saw that throughout Bosch's painting there were these interesting structures. Every time I look at them, I want to say animal, vegetable, or mineral, because you can't quite tell. Are they plant forms that are growing there? Are they something that human creations? Parts of them look quite fleshy, like are they some kind of weird animal or something like a hybrid of animal and plant? What could they be? Well, they're often called fountains, especially because they're in the, this one's in the middle of water and it looks like there's some water spurting out from it. So it's it's a fountain which Lorena Dixon identifies with the alchemical fountain, which is found, and she had a number of pictures of these. I just picked out one. In this case, it looks sort of like a pillar. It's in the middle of a pond, and you have all of this plant life around it, and then Adam and Eve on either side. So she suggests that this could be the alchemical fountain. And she says that each panel is another step in the process of distillation. So in a sense, when you look at this, you are creating that medicine, symbolic for that. In the center, as I said, we've got our nude people cavorting, having lots of fun. This, she thinks, is the alchemical allegory for the next step in the process of distillation, which is called conjunction, joining together, in which the elements are joined by bubbling happily together. Now, this stage of distillation has a number of different names. One of them is child's play. Another is turning upside down. If you think of something that's bubbling and it's turning and cavorting and rolling. And then there is also that idea of joining together once again. So you have this analogy to mating behavior. So let's look at it with our alchemical text images, our little black and white images that you're seeing here from a manuscript. And as you can see, they show bubbles, something. You've put your two disparate elements together, you've lit your fire under them, and they are bubbling together as though it were children playing. Now, you're not having children playing in the center, but you have I guess you could say, erotic play in the center. So is that similar? Nude figures playing. Something even closer, perhaps, is the fountain in the background. And as you can see, there's a lot of sexual activity going on there, or erotic activity anyway, including these two people who are upside down right next to each other. And these two vessels that are shown in the alchemical text are a very similar shape to the alchemical fountain. One of them shows the two elements are mating. The two elements are, joining together. And the other one is the turning upside down. It's, as this stuff bubbles, it bubbles around and turns and swirls around.
So it's almost as though they took these two images and put them together for Bosch's little upside down people. One of the interesting things, too, is there are some curious objects that look to be, there are some curious objects that look like glass cylinders, transparent cylinders. You see a few of them there, some other ones that are illustrated. And then we have also, I guess the 15th, 16th century equivalent of test tubes. As you can see, these glass cylinders. Is that a reference to alchemy, or is it something else? Incidentally, those two figures you see in this detail where the woman is behind the transparent cylinder, and there's a man who's, I think, about the only figure who's wearing clothing besides Christ. He seems to have a kind of hair shirt or something on, primitive shirt, and he's pointing to her. Some people call those figures Adam and Eve. I don't know. But there they do. Well, you've got your elements bubbling happily together, but eventually all the moisture is out of them. When you do distillation, you usually have a tube that goes into another vessel or beaker. And of course, as things boil, that steam rises and it goes through the through the tube, and then as it cools, reconverts to liquid and comes down in the other beaker. And of course, that would be your medicine. But what's left in the first beaker is putrefaction. The alchemical stage of putrefaction. When those elements are burnt and blackened, all the moisture and the essence has gone out of them and has been distilled into something else. And they call this stage of alchemy, besides putrefaction, they call it hell. And likened to a fiery hell. And here we see our alchemical images with the alchemical beaker, or the alembic, in a giant medieval hell mouth burning away. And then down below we see hell as a fiery city. And what do we see here? That fiery city in the background of Bosch's hell. These alchemical vessels take all different shapes. Some of them are shaped like eggs. We'll be seeing one of those in a little bit. And so here you have this figure that's often called the egg man, or sometimes the tree man, because his legs seem to be trees and his body seems to be an egg. Also, you have these interesting shaped vessels, which you can see here, that twist around. And they look a little like this bagpipe that you see. Okay, so here we have the tree man, or the egg man. What Lorinda Dixon points out that, you have these people, so within him as though it's a kind of satanic tavern. And she thinks those may be the evil alchemists. They're in there somewhere. But you also have this great disc on his head that becomes a kind of ballroom with a giant bagpipe. And devils are leading people around as though in a perpetual dance forever. And she points out the similarity in shape. Now, let me point something out about the moral interpretation and what they would say about that bagpipe. Bagpipes were considered to be lewd instruments. I can kind of attest to that. Once upon a time, I was in Vicenza in northern Italy, and the next day I was going to be leaving for Germany, so this was before the euro, so I had to kind of hoard my lira because I had to pay for my hotel and I had to pay for my meal, and I wasn't sure, I didn't want to stretch it that far. But at any rate, the point being that a street musician playing a bagpipe wanted me to give him money, and I was afraid I wouldn't be able to pay for my meal. I wouldn't if I gave him money. So, I didn't give him money. And he followed me down the street playing from his bagpipe these weird sounds.
And I could barely keep a straight face because it sounded lewd. It really was. It was mocking. It was lewd. I mean, he wanted me to force me into giving him something. And the thing was, I wished I had a tape recorder. This was long before digital images, because I thought, oh God, I wish I could take this back and show my students what it means. Okay, well, that was my encounter with why bagpipes might sound lewd. I was really curious. But there's another one, and it's visual. I'm a student sitting in my class, and I'm looking at this, and I say to my professor, well, why are bagpipes considered to be, lewd instruments? And he looked at me and said, because they are the shape of male genitalia. Okay. A little bit proportionally off, perhaps, but that's what he said. Okay. So we have both alchemical and moral interpretations of some of these details. They do overlap a bit, incidentally. Okay, back to just remind you what the whole thing looks like. Eden, cavorting, and hell. Now let's close it. Now let's pull those panels closed and see what's painted on the back of Eden and hell. And this is the earth in the process of creation. According to the alchemical interpretation, the final stage of distillation, and she says it's circular, you can keep doing this over and over again. The final stage of distillation is purification or ablution. And presumably that's when everything is cleansed and you've got your medicine here. Now, besides that, what does this picture just tell us in and of itself? There's an inscription on it. If you look up in the upper left, there's a little tiny picture of God the Father. And then there's an inscription that goes between both of the panels. And translated, it says from Psalms, something like, He spoke and it was created. So that pretty clearly suggests that this image is showing you the process of creation. As I mentioned, there is a theory that it's the flood of Noah. But, as I said, the inscription says creation, and that seems to me to be pretty final. So let's look closer. We see, of course, this crystalline sphere of the earth, and instead of things being created on the outside, it's as though there's a kind of disk inside, and it looks, very watery around the edge, and then it seems like land is coming out of the water. It's coming into being. It's transmuting, perhaps, from one thing to another. From nothingness to air, to liquid, to solid, all different kinds of things here. And you can see that some things look like a pretty normal landscape, where others are these weird, are they rocks? What are they? There's even over here at the far left, a little figure that looks like a test tube with a tail, or a stick of dynamite, however you interpret it, that Lorinda Dixon points out as well. So is this in the world? Is this the world being transmuted? That creation is a kind of alchemical process of transmutation. And she's got some pictures here to show us. Here you have one of the few surviving alchemical eggs, which you see the actual photograph of a glass egg, essentially, with a little spout on the side. And then you have the drawings and the little paintings, where you have the earth in a very similar fashion, only much more schematic, as a round object, actually with a beaker. It has a little spout, which our earth does not, and a kind of watery substance within. You have God sort of creating the world, once again, in this sort of glass sphere. And you see the trees and the plants all coming into being. And then here is this alchemist who's working, and as you can see, steam is rushing into this globe. And here it is again. Okay, when I heard her paper, I told people I went to scoff because I thought it would be one of the alchemical arguments that were just so esoteric and all that. But she had those pictures. The pictures were, I want to say, the pictures were the proof, as it were. There's a cute little story that they tell about Erwin Panofsky. And, and he said once, if you want to prove it, don't illustrate it. The joke, of course, very tongue-in-cheek, was that if you show people the pictures rather than just doing a verbal argument, they might see that your argument is wrong, and you can't prove it that way. On the other hand, what he really meant is, if you can see it, that's some evidence. Do illustrate it. That's probably the most convincing evidence, along with the historical, along with the documentary, but certainly is something we can see. Okay, so after the lecture, after the session, I went up to Lorinda Dixon. I didn't know her then. I know her now. And I said to her, do you think that this precludes the moral interpretation, or could they be read on both levels? I forget exactly how I phrased it. She said, oh, no, they can both work together. So I proceeded to come up with a kind of theory about it, which is, the question is, can the moral and alchemical interpretations be reconciled? In other words, if somebody had this alchemical knowledge, this secret knowledge perhaps, and looked at this picture and said, oh yeah, this is the in story, they would understand it. But most people wouldn't. Most people would just look at it and see, all these curious creatures. And looking at the whole thing, the same way you might look at the Hay-Wain triptych, would read it as a moral allegory or a moral lesson. So it seemed to me that, yes, these two interpretations could be reconciled, that different people could read them on different levels. So I answer the question, yes. Both suggest that mankind must undergo a spiritual distillation, analogous to the alchemical process, if he is to find the elixir of life, the remedy for sin and disease. Now, that elixir could be an actual medicine, but it is also identified with Christ and his expiation of sin. Christ is the elixir of life. And, the virtuous alchemist is going to work essentially with the sacraments of the church, not just thinking he can find some kind of, physical way of solving this whole thing, discovering the elixir of life. At any rate, on one level, the alchemical allegory could be read as a moral or a religious message. And I think probably, when you look at it, it seems to me that that religious message, that moral message, here's where people began, here's where they continue to sin, and here's where they're going to end up, in hell, is the most clear. But if you've got that secret knowledge, you can read it alchemically. And they both work together. Okay. We often talk about Bosch's hell scenes, but there actually still exist a few heaven scenes. You see here we have both heaven and hell. Now, these are panels that are in the Palazzo Ducale, the Ducal Palace in Venice. And we presume, just from the subject, that the center of either this was a triptych with, I don't know whether there's anything on the back of these or not. It may be that that there was a triptych and the back was split. Or it could be that these are from a Vondel altar. In other words, it could open up several different ways. And then at the center, which is lost, would have been a last judgment. You have two scenes of heaven, two scenes of hell. Let's take a look at those. Now, let's look at heaven first. Heaven's shown two ways. You have a terrestrial paradise, this beautiful garden that you enter. If you think back to Jan van Eyck's image of the Adoration of the Lamb in the Ghent altarpiece, he showed heaven as this beautiful landscape, this beautiful garden that just went on and on forever. It had churches in it, of course. This one has a beautiful fountain. There was, of course, the fountain of life in Jan van Eyck's Adoration of the Lamb. And presumably that's what this is as well. But just, you can see the angels have welcomed people. They're resting or marveling at the beauty of heaven. And the other one shows them rising even higher, you might say. The ascent of the blessed to the celestial paradise. And so angels are carrying these people up, and they're going up to this cylinder of light. You see light at the end, this tunnel of light. And it has been suggested that this has been described in mystical visions as the entry, into the celestial heaven. One of the things that always intrigues me about this is it reminds me of some of the accounts of near-death experiences, people today who are pronounced dead, and then because usually modern medicine, their heart stops, for example, but they're able to revive them. And sometimes people will come back and say that they saw a tunnel of light with a figure at the end, whom some people, Christians will sometimes identify as Jesus, or sometimes, one of their parents or grandparents, or just someone waiting for them. Some people say, no, what they're doing is seeing dopamines, or just the way the body breaks down as you start to die. It's a purely physical process. Other people think that they are actually having a vision of the afterlife, and that they are, getting ready to enter it. I don't know whether Bosch ever had such a vision, or whether, as I say, the likely source are texts from mystics. But it certainly is intriguing. And then, of course, the other side of it, hell, the fall of the damned, and people here in despair in this, this fiery hell at the bottom.